I've been reading Dracula by Bram Stoker, and it's a pretty good book, but I'm still a history student while I'm reading this, and so I can't help but think, why Dracula? I mean, I know that Bram Stoker based him off a early modern, late medieval Wallachian voivode called Vlad Tepes, but why Vlad Tepes? Why did an Anglo-Irishman turn this one Wallachian voivode into a vampire?
I guess for now you've got the last laugh.
Okay, so who was Vlad Tepes? Well, he was the ruler, the voivode of the southeastern European feudal state of Wallachia. And what you need to know about Wallachia at the time is that it was squeezed between the Hungarian kingdom in the north and the Ottoman Empire to the south. And those two countries were at war with each other throughout most of the 15th century. But in the early 1460s, they made a peace deal. Part of that peace deal was this one small country between us. We're okay with it existing between us, but we don't like the guy who's in charge of it. So let's exchange him for his brother, Radu, who the Ottomans had at their disposal at the court in Istanbul. So what happened? The Hungarians met with Vlad, took him prisoner, and then Radu got placed on the throne of Wallachia. Now, in order to legitimate this political power play, the Hungarians just kind of went and ran with some of the stories that were circulating about Vlad. Basically, part of why he was able to keep the throne of Wallachia is that he was fairly brutal in his battle tactics. You might know him under the name of Vlad the Impaler. Basically, Vlad liked to impale people. And these stories were kind of pushed by the Hungarian kings in order to, legitimate their taking Vlad hostage. And they traveled. They traveled from Wallachia through the Kingdom of Hungary into one particular city, Vienna. And from there, well, something very interesting happened with those stories. So I think we should go to Vienna and find out what exactly happened there. Hello, hello. Okay, this thing behind me here, it'll focus on, that's a statue of Johannes Gutenberg, the inventor of the printing press. Now the statue itself, there we go, is from the 19th century. It has nothing to do with the time of Vlad Tepes. The invention, however, does. It was made in the 1450s. That's a decade before Vlad got arrested. And, well, Gutenberg himself has nothing to do with Vlad. His invention does. Because in the 1450s, a guy by the name of Ulrich Hahn came to Vienna and set up a print shop there. Now back then, Vienna didn't look like that. It looked a bit more like this place, right here. That behind me there is the Ruprechtskirche. It's the oldest church still standing in Vienna. It gives you a bit of a sense of how the whole place looked. Smaller, basically. Now, I'm standing here because we don't actually know where Ulrich Hahn lived and worked. His place just didn't survive. What we do know, however, is that in the year 1463, he printed a pamphlet about Vlad. Now remember, that is just a year after Vlad's arrest. But he still goes ahead and prints a pamphlet called Geschichte Dracula Weide. Now, this, just as an aside, this wasn't a particularly good story that Hahn told. It's just basically a series of anecdotes strung together to tell a more or less cohesive narrative, but that's not what was important about this story. What was important was its form, not its content. See, because this is one of the first stories ever to be printed. Remember, this is only happening a decade or so after the printing press's invention. This is one of the first stories that gets disseminated through the print media. And that's what makes all the difference here. Hahn sells multiple print runs. Now, we don't have anything left from the first print run that Hahn did, but we do have something left from the later print runs. And from those, we have 4 copies left. One's in Austria, another's in Switzerland, one's in France, and the last one's in the UK. And here we suddenly get a sense of the travel that this story had and how it was suddenly able for such stories to travel. And Han wasn't the only one who was telling this story, by the way. In the months and the years after he started his Geschichte Dracula Weide, copycats sprung up all across the German-speaking world who were selling more or less similarly titled stories all about Vlad Tepes as well. And I want us to really notice the rapid succession of events here. This is all taking place within 20 years of the printing press's invention. Han comes to Vienna, Vlad's story arrives, he prints this story, it goes viral, so to speak, travels across Europe, so people start copying him. Vlad wasn't the end-all be-all of cruel tyrants. He arrived at a time when suddenly got able to share, suddenly it became possible to share a story about a cruel tyrant all across Europe. But Vlad didn't just live at the time of one very important change in European history. There was another thing that was going on, another change that impacted, that created his reputation. But to understand that one, we need to go to the Hofburg. So I'm here in what is now the oldest part of the Hofburg. Back then would have just been the Hofburg. And in the winter of 1463, then Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III held his court here. And that's important for us because Frederick III had a poet at his court by the name of Michael Beheim. And Michael Beheim copied Ulrich Hahn's poem. But unlike the copycats of him in the whole German-speaking world who were just reprinting his pamphlet or maybe adding a bit to it and giving it a different title, Beheim translated it into a different medium. He performed it, he sang it at the court of Frederick III here. He called it von einem Wuttrich, der hieß Dracula Weide von der Walachei. And importantly for us, this was not the end-all be-all of Michael Beheim. He went on to have an illustrious career in the German-speaking world. In other words, here's yet another avenue through which Vlad's story gets transported throughout the wider world through a different medium now. And here again, another revolution is taking place. Because see, Beheim was what was then called a Minnesänger, which is kind of a court musician in an aristocratic court. But Beheim was also standing at the intersection, at the crossroads between the tradition of Minnesang at aristocratic courts and a new tradition, which would later be called Meistergesang. It was basically the same thing. You could sing the same poems, but it was performed in different settings. The settings now weren't the aristocratic courts of the nobility, but rather middle-class venues, taverns, town halls, etc. Why was this happening? Well, basically, 1463, we're at the beginning of a different European revolution, the Renaissance. And one of the consequences of the Renaissance was that the middle classes got bigger in Europe, which means suddenly you have more people who have more disposable income for something like a story sung by a musician. And this basically was just another avenue for Vlad's story to get out there, to get spread across Europe. I've put it somewhere technically quieter because I just wanted to conclude a bit. See, basically, Vlad didn't do anything except for fall victim to political machinations at a specific point in time at which a big technological change had just hit Europe and a big social change was just hitting Europe. And these two changes combined made it possible for European-wide stories to be able to be created, because that's what Vlad became at the end of the day. Vlad Tepes became Vlad the Impaler, became a Europe-wide yardstick for measuring cruelty among rulers. And Vienna, as the closest regional capital, well, aside from Budapest, but that was part of the regional political machinations that led to Vlad Tepes' arrest, was the place from which these stories then spread out to the rest of Europe, to the rest of the discourse, and turned Vlad into the figure that he became. But for all of this, we still have one question that's left unanswered. How did Vlad Tepes become Dracula? Well, think about it. What were the names of the poems that I just told you? Geschichte Dracula Weide. Eine Geschichte von einem Wütrich, der hieß Dracula Weide van der Walachei. The poets, the storytellers, which were creating this narrative around Vlad, were using the name Dracula already. And they got it because Dracula was Vlad's by name. Well, not precisely, his by name was Vlad Dracula. People think that it's because his father was part of an Order of the Dragon. We don't quite know exactly, but it was one of his by names. And for some reason, that's the name that these artists in Vienna, at the beginning of the Renaissance, at that, time between the late Middle Ages and the early modern era, chose to name him. And so that's where Bram Stoker found Vlad. That's where he picked up on Vlad. That's where he took his reputation and took it to the next level. Vlad was the cruel ruler par excellence in the European imagination. Why precisely Bram Stoker used this ruler to become his vampire? We don't know. But hey, I mean, the cruel ruler par excellence, not a bad place to start.